I hope to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes challenging you to take a journey that I took over the course of many years. I don't know if you'll arrive at the same destination, but my hope is that the process enables you to look at privilege, prejudice, and purpose from within your own experience. Because the fact is that we're all pretty good at pointing out the work that others need to do to address the ills of our society. The most pressing of them at this moment is being a set of presumptions about race that denies the fullest measure of basic civil and human rights enjoyed by white people to people of color, including but not exclusively to Black Americans and Native peoples. Those of us who are gathered electronically are here because of the efforts of the Wyoming Interfaith Network, including my newish friend, Carl Carmichael, and my virtual friend, Jordan Bishop. And I thank you both and all of you for including me in this historic conference. Because our context is faith and philosophy, theists, agnostics, and atheists alike, I want to talk about what we believe and how it needs constant re-examination. Here's a better way to say that. I want to talk about what I believe and how it needs constant re-examination. So I begin with a simple statement that became very complicated for me. I do not believe there is any such thing as coincidence. Most of my adult life has been spent as a rabbi in a synagogue setting, and in that capacity, I understood that I had two responsibilities in everything I said, especially from the pulpit. The first was to speak faithfully, and the second was always to tell the truth. I think that set of obligations pertains to anyone who holds a position of leadership if integrity is any part of the person's value system. I'm unembarrassed to admit that I believe there is a God who intentionally created the universe and everything within. I'm even willing to affirm that intention runs through that creation. However, despite my somewhat traditional faith, I have never affirmed a whimsical God willing to be swayed by prayers, however earnest, or loyalty, however unshakable. So when I claim that there is no such thing as coincidence, I'm not suggesting that there's some kind of divine micromanagement behind everyday occurrences. I was not fated to meet my wife at the moment I was looking for love, nor to befriend pastors who became dear friends, nor to agree to an invitation to serve on the board of Interfaith Alliance in its earliest days so that I would 20 years later become its president. Rather, the world in which we live is a collection of causes and results that are logical, if not always visible. Magic, luck, and fortune, that is the sense that there's some kind of alchemy that can be worked on an otherwise dependable world, are merely part of the vocabulary we use in an attempt to control what we do not yet understand. Each life consists of a series of choices and opportunities. The value of faith, to me, is the guidance it provides in making choices and responding to opportunities. The collective experiences of a community across time and circumstance within a framework of devotion to a set of values makes the human endeavor tolerable and meaningful. The foundation of my belief is Torah. And I use that word in the broadest possible sense. That is, not the Torah, not the 5 books of Moses. Rather, as it's used in Jewish tradition, teachings that have roots in the revelation signified by Moses' encounter on Mount Sinai. There was a sacred moment when the presence of God became explicit for a remarkable human being, and from the understanding and insight that flooded him, a wellspring of human potential to commune with divine inspiration emerged. Scripture is the result of that encounter, as well as every effort to enable its expression in human activity. To my mind, my heritage as a Jew, as well as my daily choice to claim my heritage as a Jew, obligates me to find my purpose. The sage Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook interpreted a prayer that is part of the liturgy for the high holidays that begin the Jewish New Year. At first glance, it's a self-deprecating admission at a time dedicated to reflection and penitence. It goes, "My God, before I was created, I was without worth. And since I was created, it's as if I am without worth." Few of us have the genuine humility to see ourselves in such terms. But Rabbi Cook suggested this understanding, paraphrased from his prayer book commentary. During the entire time I was awaiting creation, there was no reason or purpose for me to be in the world, for there's nothing incidental in this world. When it was my time to serve a purpose, I entered this world. Whenever my actions are in the service of that purpose, whatever it may be, then I am a participant in the pursuit of a world fulfilled. But should I not seek to fulfill my purpose in the world, then it is as if I had never been created, because the reason for my very existence is ignored and unfulfilled. It would be simple enough to credit this teaching with the whole of my faith-based understanding that everyone comes into this world, no matter their faith at birth or death, with some kind of purpose to fulfill. But here's the thing. I have to acknowledge that just like every other faith tradition, not to mention those philosophies and value systems that eschew a religious perspective, the Judaism of my upbringing and education posits a privileged position among those purposes for adherents of our tradition. Yes, the Torah begins with the story of humanity parented by a common origin, so that, as a later teaching affirms, no one can claim my ancestor was greater than yours. And certainly, the most oft-repeated instruction in those 5 books is to care for the stranger, that is, the outsider to our community. Undeniably, however, is the constant refrain that our relationship to the divine is exceptional, one that obligates us to behave with generosity and compassion for those uninitiated as members of our covenant. When encountering those we consider righteous, our admiration was always tinged with a sort of sadness for them. When encountering those we considered less than, our disregard could descend into exclusion. Our care for the stranger was almost conditional on their willingness to meet our standard of acceptability. And much as I would like to claim that I always felt otherwise, being candid requires that I took a certain pride in holding, however secretively, a special advantage by virtue of my identity as a Jew. No matter how much my people had suffered, though I myself was constantly blessed, no matter how biased society seemed to be against us, though I myself had no meaningful obstacle to achievement, my interest in the well-being of others more closely resembled noblesse oblige than a sense of being part of a beloved community. Now, this is not the place to catalog the hundreds of ways that message was reinforced by lessons cultivated during hundreds of years of Jewish practice and thought. And besides, though my faith may have a source I call divine, my religion, the collective experiences of my community, was no less human than the beliefs and practices of others. Every tradition I have encountered included the teaching that its adherents held a special advantage by virtue of their identity. The most accepting versions of every religion with which I've interacted have included that same quality that I somehow missed the critical ingredient of their unique understanding of God. Whether couched as concern for my mortal soul, or an expression of divine love, or a sense of mission to redeem the world, I always reacted with quiet exasperation when my Jewish commitments were deemed good, but never good enough. But it took many years for me to begin to question myself. Was I guilty of the same kind of judgment, subtly or even silently hoping that people I knew and loved, including fellow Jews whose attachments were different from mine, would see the inadequacies in their spiritual lives and discover the truth that I affirmed? Before Rabbi Cook's teaching gave me a framework to address that question, I was well into middle age. Instead, I had reached a sort of negative version of this same conclusion as I struggled with the consequences after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. It was long the custom of our synagogue to share a Thanksgiving Eve service with local churches. The relationships among those institutions were warm and deep. They welcomed us to our buildings and allowed us to obscure their iconography when our own building was undergoing renovation. That year was my turn in the rotation of clergy to offer the message at our Interfaith service weeks after the airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center, a Pennsylvania field, and in our own neighborhood, the Pentagon. I was immersed in offering comfort and commentary like most clergy during those weeks. But something was squirming inside my soul, and I spoke to it, I hope faithfully and honestly. I said that the men who flew those 4 planes into buildings and grounds were in pursuit of a religious mandate. They turned their lives over to God as they understood God. They lived their values and principles of their religion as they understood those values and principles. They were religious guys, maybe not by my standards, but judging themselves the way I judge myself, they were religious guys. They had a vision for the world, and we Americans did not fit that vision. In fact, we Americans were working against that vision. So we Americans had to be stopped, lest we continue to pollute their vision of the world. In their mind's eye, the destination of history is a world living in submission to the will of Allah, and the world will be redeemed when Allah reigns supreme and the infidels have been converted or eliminated. Now, my friends, here it's important to acknowledge that such an understanding of Islam is not affirmed by the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the world, and certainly not literally, even among most of those who do. Every tradition has its extremists who read the mandates selectively, both for good and for ill. And some smaller subset commits themselves to imposing that reading on unwilling others. Were these men evil? Well, by my standards, certainly. And my first reaction was that this world would not be redeemed until evil like theirs was, well, converted or eliminated. Over the weeks that I reflected on my conclusion, I couldn't fathom the notion that there was some moral equivalency between my attitude and the actions of those murderous terrorists. And I still reject the notion, even as I struggle. It was instead the vision of Isaiah, reported in chapter 65, that held the seeds of my reconsideration. The prophet foresaw a, quote, new heaven and a new earth, built on the universal acceptance of the other. The former things shall not be remembered, they shall never come to mind. Be glad then and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I shall create Jerusalem as a joy and her people as a delight, and I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in her people. Never again shall there be heard the sounds of weeping and wailing. No more shall there be an infant or graybeard who does not live out his days. He who dies at 100 years shall be reckoned a youth, and he who fails to reach 100 years shall be reckoned accursed. They shall build houses and dwell in them. They shall plant vineyards and enjoy their fruit. They shall not bear children for terror, but they shall be a people blessed by the Lord. The wolf and the lamb shall graze together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. Nothing evil shall be done, said the Lord. What would that new heaven and new earth look like? When Isaiah prophesies, the former things shall not be remembered, they shall never come to mind, does it include the values and practices to which my vocation and my heart had been devoted? If the lion will eat straw like the ox, if the serpent's food will be the earth, will I keep the Sabbath, the dietary laws, the festivals and the fasts? Will Midrash matter? Will we yet teach the Talmud? And will there any longer be a need for sacred scripture? If the world were perfected under God's sovereignty tomorrow, if the Messiah arrived and the world was at peace, would I still be Jewish? It's no small question. I challenged the people I knew to ask themselves the same kinds of questions about their own sets of belief. Our agony, I figured, would be the same. The true believer, the person who lives his life in the square mile of Torah, the person who's given over her life entirely to Jesus, the person who is submitted entirely to the will of Allah, that person believes he or she is living in the closest approximation to paradise here on earth. And inevitably, the conclusion must be that the only thing holding the world back from redemption is those who will not see the light. So I asked this question of my colleagues, rabbis who participate with me in an online discussion group. One of them was quite clear. The redeemed world is a Jewish world. There is no room for paganism and polytheism. The Trinity must become the unity, and Buddhists must be theists, or they have no share in that world yet to come. Another one danced a little bit and suggested that in such a world, we would broaden our definition of what it meant to be a monotheist so as to expand the circle of those currently outside. And one, playing on a common misreading of Isaiah's prophecy, said, "The lion will lie down with the lamb, but the Jews get to be the lion." How could I look my beloved Interfaith community members in the eyes and say, do your best at what you do, but it will never be quite good enough? Beholding the gash in the side of the Pentagon, wrought by true believers in an unfamiliar faith, could I say that when the paradigm really shifts, I'll still be right, but the rest of you will yet be wrong? Another friend of mine, a rabbi, both my teacher and friend, sent me another response. He wrote, "The covenant with Abraham and some of his descendants was an interim expedient following Adam's and Eve's removal from paradise and the failure of the initial covenant attempts with Noah. I am part of a covenant chain that began with Abraham and will conclude with Messianic times. I dare not break the link in my generation. Judaism, though temporary, is an experiment of the highest order. Hopefully, it points us in the right direction. It is not the only such experiment, but Judaism's glory is that at the end of days, it will not be. It is a means to a greater end. In Messianic times, right behavior would be engraved on each and every heart." His message soothed my soul and made me deeply sad. I'm not sure if I was sad from a sense of ultimate loss or at my blindness in mistaking the road for the destination. Either way, I wondered how I would recognize what that redeemed world looked like. What kind of destination does Judaism lead us to find along a parallel but distinct path with Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and 1,000 more ways to reach for the ultimate concern? It was Rabbi Cook's teaching that began to lift the sadness and help me gain an appreciation that is necessary to engage in interfaith work with integrity. No person enters this world without a purpose, a necessary piece of a complicated puzzle to contribute. The new heaven and new earth is dependent on this grand experiment these interim expedients. Some of them trace their origins to stories of ancient origins or of profound encounters with the cosmos. Some of them are discovered in the depths of introspection or the teachings of more modern teachers who themselves have found enlightenment in the gifts of human consciousness. My filter, my Judaism, does not affirm that a life of divine or redemptive purpose is reserved exclusively for Jews. Indeed, to suggest that heresy is to suggest my ancestor was greater than yours. Rather, I believe that, as the Quran insists, and I paraphrase, we are created with differences so as to get to know each other. The same Jewish teaching that argues the equality of creation includes an instruction that makes it clear that it applies in every contemporary moment. An almost identical teaching is in the Quran as in the Talmud. One who destroys a single life destroys an entire world, and whoever preserves a single life preserves an entire world. Perhaps it's an elegant way of elevating the value of existence itself. But in the context of the teaching of Rabbi Kook, life is not merely existence. Indeed, life is purpose. The aphorism is not a poetic restatement of the prohibition of murder. It's a caution about wasting one's own pursuit of sacred purpose or of frustrating the sacred purpose of another. By doing so, the entire world is without a necessary ingredient toward wholeness. Every action, every event in this world has a cause. The cause may not be apparent at first look, but it can be identified with enough diligence. Incidents may coexist, but they are never, in the colloquial sense, coincidental. I am not yet certain I have found the purpose which made my life needed in this world. I have faith that I have at least found my path, which I continue to pursue with purpose. But I've awakened to the importance of every life's true purpose in this world, and to preserving and protecting the path that increases the nearness of the new heaven and new earth. That is true not only for my fellow Jews, but also for all people of faith. That is true not only for my fellow people of faith, but also for those who are skeptics, agnostics, and atheists. In other words, protecting faith and freedom of conscience is at least part of the purpose with which I live my life. You know, there's an old Jewish wisdom teaching that says, when a baby comes into the world, its hands are clenched, as if to say, the whole world is mine, and I will never let it go. But when a person dies, those same hands open, as if to say, I have nothing to hold. So much of life is learning to let go. And for me, that includes the presumption that I, as a rabbi, hold some piece of knowledge or insight that is essential to others, especially if they're not Jews. When my fingers finally began to relax, I learned the importance of listening and following. Being a good ally means being a good follower, and that begins with open hands that are ready to receive, not clenched fists ready to engage a fight. It took a long time to understand the irony of that little teaching. There's more to hold when you don't try so fiercely to grasp. Instead, I try to remember to ask my allies and coalition partners in interfaith work what they need from me to help them succeed in pursuit of their purpose. Sometimes it is to stand in silent assent behind them as they advocate for what they need, as when secularists demanded not to be less than people of faith in reasonable accommodations in the workplace. Sometimes it is to raise my voice in solidarity, as when I proclaimed myself ready to be registered or banned if Muslims were so mistreated by a new president. Sometimes it is to engage them in heart-rending conversations, as when a Hindu colleague of mine asked me when he would be allowed to reclaim the sacred symbol of his faith, the swastika. Sometimes when I'm invited, it is to offer the contributions I've gleaned from my own perspective. And on occasion, it is to ask that they stand with me in support of my values and concerns. There's a framework to be mutually supportive at this moment in history, the moment at which you and I have been called into life. Almost 250 years ago, a group of activists coalesced around an idea that evolved into a reality. It was about a place that recognizes equally the many paths and welcomes every person who arrives on its shores. It was about a place that gleans the best that each of us can bring to it in service to each other in a world redeemed. It was about a place that begins with the premise of the sanctity of human life and experience and yearns in its songs and society for that time when there will be no sounds of weeping and wailing, no more infant or graybeard who does not live out his or her days, where nothing evil or vile shall be done. They proclaimed it, however flawed, in a Declaration of Independence and enshrined it in a call to create a more perfect union. They included a protection of the paths through religion and philosophy that allowed individual gifts to thrive. And they embraced the notion that out of the many would emerge one. I hope that even at my age, it's not too late to add my purpose to theirs so that my life has worth.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. We are grateful that you were able to spend some time with us, and your speech was enlightening, to say the least. I see there are some questions in the chat room there. We want to open those up. It was really good to hear from you again, though, Rabbi. It's been too long since we've had a face-to-face, vis-a-vis Zoom conversation. And I appreciate it very much. And I know that WIN as an organization does the same. Thank you. Thank you.